from Tafshin Lamedalud, like all the Mamorim from the Dvar Malchus this year, primarily are from that year. Same comes out the same kviyas. Okay. Says on some nafsheinu b'chayim b'leim noslam mitraglein. He placed our soul in life, as we'll soon be medayik what that means, and he didn't allow for our foot to collapse. And the one who was, this is a mimer from Yud Beis Tammuz, so the one who was imprisoned and whose day of redemption it is, analyzed this in one of the mamorim of the redemption. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe had a series of mamorim that are associated with Yud Beis Tammuz. Every year he said a mimer on Yud Beis Tammuz or a few mamorim. So one of the mamorim, he analyzed this pasuk. Shemaskal pasuk begins with this pasuk. He says that the soul is something that is essentially alive. Like the Frierdiker Rebbe explains this topic even in regards to the other soul powers, the difference and the way how the other soul powers are, and their chayis versus the chayis of the nefesh itself. So it's an essentially alive thing. It's not just about giving and adding life to something else, even though that is a result of the fact that the nefesh is chay be'etzem. So he says, V'im kain, the Frierdiker Rebbe asked, if so, ma'u omre asam nafsheinu b'chayim, what does he say? He places our soul in life. When you say you're placing it in life, that means that the soul is not living, but the soul is essentially alive. It's not receiving life from something else. It's not being vitalized by something else. You don't have to place the soul into life. The soul is in and of itself alive until he's essentially alive. What is the explanation and the content of the matter that Hashem places our soul? Hasam daik, specifically he places it. Not just he guards it, etc. In a place of life. Where it says in Beis Hashimush Teves Chaim, a base that's in service of the word Chaim, so he's giving and placing it into life. It's similar to someone that takes an object, an item, and places it in a new place, not in the place that was there before. That's what means Hasam. He places it. Before it was in location A, now I'm placing it in location B. So when you say Hasam nafsheinu b'chayim, that means prior to placing, it wasn't in life. Now I'm placing it in life. How can you say that when the nefesh is chay be'etzem, when essentially the nefesh is alive? Another question that I've asked on line 13. Also, we need to understand the connection, the association to the continuation of the pasuk. The Frierdiker Rebbe asks, they didn't allow that our legs should collapse. But lamoit doesn't just mean collapse, but it has another meaning as well. She's a kol gam shlilas inyan shel netia belvad meloshen mata yadai. It's also excluding that there should not be even a leaning, that the word mata yadi means. Not just it shouldn't collapse like we've been translating, but even that doesn't end up to be leaning. First of all, even concerning the lowest part of a person, even the foot, there shouldn't be the idea of lamoit hascholas hakfifa shal regel bavad, that it should be the beginning of the bending even of the foot. He doesn't allow for that. So what's the connection between that part of the pasuk and the beginning of the pasuk, asam nafsheinu b'chayim, that the soul is somehow placed in life? Oizbeis, Mamshba Maimer, the Maimer, the Friedrich Rebbe continues, Shasforno Pirish Hason Nefscheinu B'chaim. Now, the Sforno explains the meaning of the first part of the Pasuk, Shechionu V'kiyim Esbonov, that Hashem enlivened us and made his children exist, Bein Umas Ha'olam, amongst the nations of the world, Neged HaTeva, in opposition against nature. That is the first part. The second part, he doesn't allow our legs to bend. That the nations of the world should not be able to, heaven forbid, push us away from upon the Eibishter. So that's the two parts of the pasuk, and therefore there's a bit of a connection over here. First of all, we survived. Physically, we survived amongst the nations, and secondly, that spiritually they weren't able to move us away from it. So now the Rebbe says that in explaining this, there are many different levels that we can explain it on. Bahagdim, he says in line 22, we can preface Jesofarish in Yezebekame, and we can explain this matter in many ways. Just like in all matters, that there's explanations from one extreme to another extreme. You can begin to explain the matter from the lowest and the lower of the lowest, until you can explain the matter into the ultimate highest level. Top of page 9. Also, just like concerning the Maimer that he wrote while he was in prison, that the Rebbe referred to in the previous Maimer, the previous Maimer the Rebbe quoted from the Maimer Min HaMeitzar that Friedrich Rebbe wrote in prison. Dvar Malchus, the Maimer entitled Min HaMeitzar Karasi Yudkei Anoni V'Marchav Yudkei. From the narrow confines I called out to Yudkei. He responds to me in the broadness of Yudkei, Kemuskara Maimer Shlifnezel, like was mentioned the Rebbe's Maimer prior to this Maimer. In the Maimer, the Friedrich Rebbe, he originally speaks about Min HaMeitzar in the most simple meaning of constriction and constraints and difficulties. In the original Maimer of the Friedrich Rebbe that he said or wrote while he was imprisoned on the first day of Rosh Chodesh Tammuz that the Rebbe quotes from. So over there in that Maimer, the Friedrich Rebbe goes through a series of psukim, one after another, quoting David HaMelech and Tillim about how he speaks about and davens to Hashem while being, chased by his enemies and so on. Now, it was very apropos because the Friedrich Rebbe was actually living that in the most extreme sense when he was writing or saying that Maimer. He was actually imprisoned with his life in actual danger. Moving my Maimer, like it's understood from the context of the Maimer, Shakavoni Hila Maimer the Matzav Shoiba Beis HaMeiser, that his intention in these words Min HaMeitzar and bringing all these psukim that David HaMelech describes his enemies trying to get rid of him and so on. So he was actually using the words of David HaMelech to describe his own personal state and situation that was during imprisonment. It was a literal confinement. He was in prison. Till the ultimate state of being low and abused and physically being beaten by guards constantly. And up till the ultimate thing, he was liable for the death penalty, like the Friedrich Rebbe said, that he saw the actual document when he was sent out to exile, when he was told that he sent out to exile, that originally on the top of the document where it listed he was meant to be executed, and that was crossed out, and then it was supposed to be 10 years imprisonment, and that was crossed out, etc. So when the Friedrich Rebbe said Min HaMeitzar, he was referring to literal Min HaMeitzar. And then it's interesting that Maimer doesn't even use the Maimer the Friedrich Rebbe that he wrote while he was in prison, doesn't even bring the second part of the pasuk. It only says Min Hameitza Karasi Yudke, and speaks all about Min Hameitza Karasi Yudke and why Yudke, like we spoke about, why Yudke Vovke, etc. He doesn't even conclude on Nani Vamerchav Yudke, but just like Min Hameitza Karasi Yudke has the simple meaning of the sense, literal confinement and troubles and difficulties, so too there was the latter half of the pasuk that eventually happened. And then afterwards it was followed by Hashem should respond to me or will respond to me in the broadness, in the literal sense. That's the idea that he was released from imprisonment on the date of Yud Beis Tammuz. So that is the way the pasuk and the issue is understood on the lowest level, like we were saying earlier. There's the way things are understood in the most lowest, simple level, and then there's the way it's understood in the most high. So now, in addition to what we saw in the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimer, quoted in the previous Maimer, about Min HaMeitzar, and therefore Anoniva Merchav Yudke, is talking about in the literal meaning in the physical world of Meitzar and Merchav, of imprisonment and release from imprisonment. So the Rebbe goes on, of Yesh Pirush Nois of being Hameitzav Merchav, but there's an additional explanation in what is the confines and constrictions and what's the broadness. The Kivim Sheklal Seder Ishtalshlos Nikra B'Shem Mitzarim V'Gvulim, since the general chain order of descent is called constraints and boundaries. Betachlis HaKavana here, and the ultimate purpose is like Gil Merchav Atzmi, to reach to the essential broadness. Hareza Yadayin Initial Meitzar, this is still a matter of constriction. V'achmetzinu Inina Meitzar Afilu B'Initial Mitzvah, until we even find that you could have in mitzvah, that's holiness, that's Hashem's will, you could find the idea of constraints and constrictions. Mitzvah Niles B'Yoser, and even a very lofty mitzvah, mitzvah shofar, like the mitzvah of shofar, like another place of Chassidus says, the shofar mitzvah is responsible for the entire Hamshacha that's going to happen for the entire year. That's why we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and that draws down a totally new Hamshacha for the entire year that was never there before. And what do we find? That the Min HaMeitzar is to be found in that mitzvah of shofar. Shaschol Satkiya B'Fiv HaKotzer Shach Shofar Nikra Gam Ki Min HaMeitzar, that the beginning of the blowing, the blast of the sound of the shofar, it begins from the narrow end of the shofar, and that is also referred to as Min HaMeitzar. And then the sound that comes out of the broader end of the shofar is called Anmani B'Merchav Ka. V'hainu, this means to say, that Rebbe says in the parentheses, Sheba mitzvah gufi yesh negam inyan ha-meitzah sheba. In a mitzvah itself, there is the constraints and the narrow and the confines. Though it's a part of a mitzvah, how can a mitzvah be constricted and constrained? Even more so, how can it be divisions and different levels in the mitzvah? So, if it's that way in a mitzvah, and similar to this, and how much more so, as long as we find ourselves within the chain order of descent of the worlds, initial mates are still a matter of confines and narrowness. And from that confines of Seder Ishtalshlus comes the tefillah and the request. From the narrowness I'm calling out, with the full tumult and the full force, like a regular constraint. So in other words, it's not, the Rebbe is saying like this: if a person is in prison, chas v'shalom, like the Friedrich Rebbe was, so the Min HaMeitzar really meant something to him. But if someone that's spiritually in tune with the Meitzar of Seder Ishtalshlus in comparison to Hashem's broadness, so it's also Min HaMeitzar, but it's not with the same passion and so on as minametz are being in a state of physical confinement, chas v'sholom. So the Rebbe says no, that this minametz hakarasi ka is with the same power as if in the literal simple meaning of being constrained and limited and locked up in prison. But the Rebbe says even more so. According to what's explained in the famous letter of the Alter Rebbe after coming from Peterburg, top of page Ches, we're talking. This is the second Igeres in Tanya that in the Igeres HaKodesh called Igeres HaKodesh Katointi. I've become minimized and small. That the Alter Rebbe writes, "Shekol HaKodev Hashem b'Yeser Seis Chulu." Whoever is closer to Hashem in a greater fashion, Hu Yoser Keloi V'Ayin V'Efes. He's even more like nothing and absolute nothing. L'chein HaYaakov Koden Moed Moed Be'enov. That's why Yaakov was very, very small in his eyes. That's why he says, Katointi, I became small. K'mayim Razal the Chazal said that why was he worried from Esav? What was his concern after he was saved from Lavan? Why was he concerned and he davened for Hashem to save him from the hands of Esav? Because he was worried, Shemer Yigrem Achet, that perhaps a sin might have caused him to lose his merits that would protect him even from Esav as well. Why would he all of a sudden think of himself as having sinned? Because he imagined in his eyes that he sinned. What does that mean? Because of his humility, being a recipient of Hashem's amazing kindness, that made him even more humble, that made him even more small in his eyes, it made him re-examine and re-experience himself in a way where perhaps there is something that's still deficient and something wrong that I wouldn't have thought before that was wrong. Therefore, based on this idea, the closer one is to Hashem, the more it's felt by him, the narrowness and the confines that's found in the person. So therefore, a spiritual narrowness, a spiritual confines that's a result of one's closeness to Hashem will be with much more a passionate feeling. Therefore, the request in the tefillah that from the constraints I call out Hashem is by such a type of person that experiences the closeness of Hashem, and because of that he's so humble and he feels himself like nothing. It's even deeper and more essential type of experience than what's experienced from just physical imprisonment. Therefore, when one experiences those spiritual levels of Mina Meitzar, so Poilim Aideza, we affect through this that he will respond to me in the broadness of Yudke Kimavur, like it's explained in many places. So this was all an example how the same pasuk, an idea in that pasuk, can be understood on different levels. There's Mina Meitzar Karasika, Anonim Merchav Yudke in the physical sense of imprisonment. There's the way we have it in Seder Ishtalshlus, and there's the way we have it in the mitzvah. In a similar vein, talking about Asam Nafsheinu B'chaim, the way the Sforno explains it, there is the way it's in the simple sense, just like the Minametz are in the simple sense, and then there is a much more spiritual level. So he says in line 9, Valderach, the movement in Yellow Divrei Sforno, the Pirush Asam Nafsheinu B'chaim. So too it's understood concerning the words of the Sforno. In explaining what it says, he placed our soul in life. That the Sforno says, Shakiyim es bonav bein umas ha'olam neged ha'teva. He made his children, Hashem made his children exist amongst the nations of the world against nature. Shenoisef ala Pirush HaPosh B'zeh, in addition to the simple meaning, that literally the Jewish survival throughout all these times that the nations of the world want to destroy us is completely something not normal. It's something that goes against the rules of nature. So in addition to that, there's also the explanation that when we talk about nature, we're talking even in the most perfect state of nature. And even that perfect state of nature, the way nature was created by Hashem originally before the Chet Hadas, etc., beyond that level of nature is where Yidden are. And as the Mimer will explain. And for this comes the promise and the assurance. Nafšiנו בחיים. Meaning, what does it mean he placed our soul in life? That Hashem puts us higher than and opposite even than the perfection of nature. So how good and how great nature is, Hashem places us in Chaim against and beyond nature. So what does that mean? So in Ois Gimel he goes on, we can connect it, what says in Kapitel 95 in Tillim, HaMizmar Shabal Maisvar Agula Shemaskom Yom Hilad to Yud Beis Tammuz. Friedrich Rebbe was born in Tov Reish Mem, 1880. This Maimer was in Tavshin Lamed Daled. Yud Beis Tammuz was the Friedrich Rebbe's birthday. So therefore, it would be going into the 95th year in Tavshin Lamed Daled, 1974. So that would be the Kapitel 95. They would start saying that year. Now, what does it say in that Kapitel? Boyu nishtachva v'nichra nivrachol fnei avayas oiseinu. Come, let us bow down and kneel and bend our knees before, or prostrate ourselves, bend down and bend our knees before Hashem, our Maker. Though earlier in the beginning of this Kapitel, of Kapitel Tzadik Hey, it says that the Eibishter is the one that rules over the entire earth and the sea. So what's this follow-up? Let us bow down, because after Hashem's rulership over the world, the natural state, there's an additional thing what man brings to the picture. Pirkei Dvar Malchus likes to brought down in Pirkei Dvar Malchus Adam Rishon Amar L'chol HaNivroim, that Adam Rishon said to all creations, Boyu nishtach v'kam, let us prostrate ourselves v'goymer v'hainu. Even though there was already the perfection, the world was at its perfect state. Like Chazal say that the world was created perfect and complete, nothing was lacking. And not only that, where in the world was Adam Rishon located? He was in Gan Eden. In a way, how he formed you in Gan Eden. Be early. Early means koydem achet, before the sin of the Eitz Hadas. So the world was at its most perfect state. So what else do you need? Mekal Malkum, still in all, then there was the inspiration and the request and the command of Adam Rishon, which also Atem Kriyim Adam, that also all of you, the Yidden, are called Adam. Come, let us prostrate and bow down and kneel before Hashem our Maker. Move on from this understood. Until Adam Rishon initiated this, it didn't exist. So that means there's two stages. There's nature, and then there's what Adam Rishon added to nature. There is a greater perfection than the perfection of the world being created, complete, and whole in every way. That is the same idea, like in the broadness of Hashem to be answered. Not the constriction of Seder Ishtalshelus, which is nature-like, but going beyond, and the broadness that breaks out of the limitations of nature, out of the limitations of Seder Ishtalshelus. How does one attain and reach that level beyond nature? Through bowing down before Hashem, our Maker.